Some wounds never heal, and some children never stop searching for their fathers. In the Norse mead hall, a giant warrior named Rolf One-Ear sits alone, haunted by battles won and lives lost. When a young servant girl approaches him and points to the scar on his hand, she speaks words that shatter his world. "My father had this scar. My mother said he never came back. 21 years ago, Rolf left a woman behind during a raid, thinking she had died. Now he stares into the eyes of Alva, the daughter he never knew existed. She has survived without him. She has grown strong without his protection. She carries his mark but not his name. As the truth settles between them, the most feared warrior in 5 kingdoms must face his greatest challenge. Can a man who mastered war learn to be a father?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great mead hall of Clan Ulfheim stood like a monument to better days, its massive timber beams blackened by decades of hearth smoke and the breath of warriors who had long since joined their ancestors in Valhalla. Tonight, as on so many nights before, the hall echoed with the low murmur of drinking men and the occasional burst of rough laughter, but the sound felt hollow against the vastness of the space. Where once 100 warriors might have feasted, now perhaps 30 remained, their voices lost in the shadows that danced between the carved pillars. Rolf One-Ear sat in his customary place near the great hearth, though not at the high table where his rank might have placed him in younger days. His massive frame, still imposing despite his 53 winters, seemed to dwarf the wooden bench beneath him. The firelight caught the silver threading through his dark beard and glinted off the empty socket where his left eye had once been, a gift from a Saxon blade during a raid on the English coast 15 years past. His remaining eye, the color of winter storms, stared into the flames with the distant look of a man who had seen too much and remembered even more. The great axe that had earned him his fearsome reputation, Skullsplitter, as the Skalds had named it, hung on the wall behind him, its double-bladed head catching the firelight like a sleeping beast. The weapon had tasted the blood of kings and jarls, had cleaved shields and split helms from the frozen fjords of Norse to the green hills of Ireland. Now it gathered dust, a relic of glory days that felt as distant as the morning mist. Rolf's fingers unconsciously traced the deep scar that ran across his right palm, a habit born of long years and longer memories. The hall itself told the story of Clan Ulfheim's slow decline. Once these walls had been hung with the finest tapestries taken in raids, the tables groaning under the weight of silver cups and golden arm rings. Now practical wool hangings kept out the worst of the winter cold, and the cups were carved horn and simple wood. The clan had not grown poor exactly, but the great days of Viking raids had passed, and with them the easy wealth that had built this place. Jarl Magnus, Rolf's cousin and the current leader of the clan, held court at the high table with the calculated cheer of a man who understood that appearances mattered. At 48, Magnus had the soft look of a man who fought his battles with words rather than blades, though he wore his mail shirt and kept his sword close out of habit and necessity. His wife, the sharp-tongued Ingrid, sat beside him, her pale eyes missing nothing as they swept the hall. Their son Bjorn, barely 22 and hungry for glory his father's generation had known, lounged nearby with the restless energy of a young wolf eager to prove himself. Near the kitchen entrance, almost invisible in her simple brown dress and worn leather shoes, Alva moved between the tables with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself useful without drawing attention. At 21, she possessed a kind of understated beauty that spoke of good bones and clear skin, though she kept her dark hair bound back severely and her eyes downcast as befitted her station. She had served in this hall for 3 years now, ever since her mother's death had left her with nowhere else to go and no family to claim her. The other servants and thralls gave her respectful distance. not from any particular dislike, but because there was something about Alva that suggested depths they could not fathom. She worked harder than most, spoke less than any, and had never been known to complain about the cold, the work, or the sometimes rough attention of the younger warriors. What they did not know, what no one in the hall knew, was that Alva's seeming acceptance of her lot masked a fierce intelligence and a burning curiosity about the world beyond the kitchen. Fires and serving tables. Her mother, Astrid, had been careful with her words in those final days when the wasting sickness had taken hold. But in her fevered moments, when the boundaries between past and present had blurred, she had spoken of things that painted a very different picture of Alva's heritage. Stories of a great warrior with a scarred hand and a voice like distant thunder. Tales of a love that had burned bright as a forge fire and ended just as suddenly. Most tellingly, she had spoken of a time when she had been more than a servant, when she had walked as an equal among the great folk of the clans. Alva had learned early to keep these stories to herself. In a world where bloodlines determined everything from where you sat to whom you could marry, claims of noble parentage from a dying servant woman would be met with suspicion at best, violence at worst. Better to work, to watch, and to wait for the right moment to seek the truth. That moment had come tonight, though she had not planned it. The evening had begun like any other. The men had gathered after the day's work, the eternal tasks of maintaining weapons, tending livestock, and strengthening the settlement's defences against the harsh Norwegian winter. They had eaten their fill of mutton stew and dark bread, washed it down with ale and mead, and settled into the comfortable ritual of drinking and storytelling that marked the end of another day. Rolf had taken his usual place apart from the main company, neither seeking conversation nor actively avoiding it. He was a man caught between worlds, too old for the wild dreams of youth, too proud to accept the gentle decline into elder status. His reputation still commanded respect, but respect tinged with the awareness that his best days were behind him. The young warriors looked at him with the mixture of admiration and pity reserved for aging heroes. While the older men saw in him a reflection of their own fading powers, it was while refilling his horn with mead that Alva had noticed it, the way the firelight caught the pale line of scar tissue across his palm as he reached for the vessel. She had seen that same mark 1,000 times in her dreams, described in her mother's whispered stories with the precision of someone who had traced it with loving fingers. The recognition had hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her hands tremble so violently that she nearly dropped the clay pitcher. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she stood frozen beside his bench, staring at the hand that might belong to her father. Rolf had noticed her stillness and looked up with mild curiosity. "Girl, is something wrong?" His voice was deep, gravelly from years of shouting battle commands and breathing smoke from countless campfires. It was also, Alva realized with a shock of recognition, exactly the voice her mother had described in those fevered final days. The words had come without conscious thought, tumbling from her lips before caution could stop them. "My father had this scar. My mother told me it marked the man who never came back." The effect had been immediate and dramatic. Rolf's face had gone white as fresh snow, his single eye widening in what looked like genuine shock. The horn had slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor and spilling its contents across the rushes. Around them, conversation had gradually died as the other men became aware that something significant was happening. Now, in the aftermath of that moment, the great hall felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Rolf stared at her as if she were a ghost made flesh, while Alva struggled to find words that might explain 21 years of questions and half-remembered stories. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending sparks up toward the smoke hole in the roof. Outside, the wind howled around the settlement's walls, carrying with it the promise of snow before morning. Inside the hall, the very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would come next. For Alva, the moment represented the culmination of years of wondering and hoping. For Rolf, it was the return of a past he had tried to bury beneath duty, honor, and the simple passage of time. Neither of them yet understood how profoundly this single exchange would change not just their own lives, but the fate of everyone in the hall and the clan itself. The silence stretched like a bowstring drawn too tight, threatening to snap under its own tension. Every eye in the hall had turned toward the unlikely pair, the giant warrior with his storm-grey eye fixed on the young servant woman who stood trembling beside his bench. The fire seemed to burn quieter, as if even the flames understood the gravity of what had just been spoken. Rolf's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "What did you say?" Alva's courage, which had carried her this far, wavered under the intensity of his stare. But something deeper than fear, a lifetime of questions and a mother's dying words, gave her strength to continue. "The scar on your hand. My mother described it to me before she died. She said it marked the man who gave her a child and then rode away to war. Your mother's name." The words came out like stones falling into still water, each one creating ripples that spread through the assembled company. Astrid Eric's daughter of the Raven clan. The name hit Rolf like a physical blow. He rocked back on the bench, his good hand moving instinctively to grip the edge of the table. Around them, murmurs began to rise from the watching men, some recognition of the name, others simply sensing the importance of the moment. From the high table, Jarl Magnus rose slowly, his politician's instincts alert to the potential implications of what was unfolding. "Rolf, what is the meaning of this?" But Rolf seemed not to hear him. His mind had been dragged back across 21 years to a raid on the Raven clan's settlement, and to a woman with dark hair and eyes the color of deep forest pools. Astrid, who had tended his wounds after a skirmish with her clan's warriors. Astrid, who had spoken to him of peace between their peoples. Astrid, who had lain with him in the secret places between settlements, away from the eyes of both their clans. "She said you would know her by this," Alva continued, reaching into the small leather pouch at her waist. With trembling fingers, she withdrew a small wooden cross, no longer than her thumb, carved from pale birch and worn smooth by years of handling. It was a simple thing, the kind that Christian missionaries had begun leaving throughout the Norse lands. But to Rolf, it was as recognizable as his own reflection. The cross had been Astrid's secret shame and hidden faith, something she had concealed from her pagan family while clinging to the teachings of the foreign priests. She had shown it to him only once, in a moment of complete trust, explaining how she had found hope in the strange God who preached love over vengeance. Rolf had not understood her faith, but he had understood her courage in keeping it. "By Thor's hammer," he breathed, the words escaping him without conscious thought. "You are Astrid's daughter." The admission sent a shock through the hall. Several of the younger warriors exchanged glances, while the older men who remembered that long-ago raid began to piece together the implications. If this serving girl was indeed the daughter of Rolf One-Ear, if she carried his blood, then everything about the clans carefully maintained. Social order would need to be reconsidered. Bjorn, the young, was the first to voice what many were thinking. "A bastard child claims kinship with one of our greatest warriors," he said, his voice carrying just enough mockery to sting without crossing into outright disrespect. "How convenient that this tale emerges now, when there is talk of winter hardships and the need for generous patrons." The accusation brought color to Alva's cheeks. But before she could respond, Rolf was on his feet with a speed that belied his years. The bench scraped against the floor as his massive frame unfolded, and suddenly the hall was reminded why this man had once been feared from Greenland to the Black Sea. "You will guard your tongue when speaking of matters beyond your understanding." "Boy," Rolf growled, his single eye fixed on Bjorn with predatory intensity. "Or I will teach you the respect your father failed to instill." Bjorn's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, then stopped as he met Rolf's stare. Whatever fires burned in the young warrior's heart, they were not yet hot enough to challenge a man who had killed kings in single combat. "Peace," Jarl Magnus commanded, his voice cutting through the tension. "We will have no blood spilled in my hall over words spoken in haste." He turned his attention to Alva, studying her with the calculating gaze of a man who understood that politics and bloodlines were often inseparable. "Girl, these are serious claims you make. If you are truly Rolf's daughter, it would make you noble-born, whatever the circumstances of your birth. But claims require proof beyond a servant's word and a carved stick." Alva met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of courage she had not known she possessed. "I ask for nothing, my lord. I seek only the truth of my parentage. My mother died believing my father was dead, killed in the raid that scattered the Raven clan. She never knew he survived, never knew he was here among the Ulfheim." The mention of the Raven clan's destruction brought a shadow across Rolf's features. That raid had been one of the darkest in his memory, not for its violence. He had seen worse, but for its aftermath. The settlement had been overrun by a rival clan. While the Ulfheim forces were withdrawing, the survivors scattered to the winds. He had searched for Astrid among the wreckage, and found only burned buildings and unmarked graves. "I thought she was dead," he said quietly. The words meant more for himself than for the listening hall. "I searched the ruins. There were so many bodies. She escaped into the forest with several other women," Alva replied. "They made their way to a Christian settlement near the coast, where the monks took them in. My mother served there until I was born, then worked as a healer for traveling merchants. She never spoke of you until the fever took her, and then only in pieces, as if the memories were too painful to hold whole." Each word seemed to drive deeper into Rolf's chest, painting a picture of suffering he had never imagined. In his mind, Astrid had died quickly in the raid, sparing her the harder fate of exile and poverty. To learn that she had lived for 20 years believing him dead, raising their child alone, struck him with a grief sharper than any blade. "There is more," Alva continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "She kept something of yours, something she said you gave her as a token of your intentions." From her pouch, she drew forth a silver ring, simple but well-crafted, bearing the raven symbol of his family line. It was a young warrior's ring, given in the heat of passion to a woman he had thought to marry once the raiding season ended. The sight of the ring, a ring he had forgotten he had ever owned, was the final proof Rolf needed. His legs seemed to lose their strength, and he sank back onto the bench as if the weight of 21 years had suddenly settled on his shoulders. "Astrid," he whispered, and there was a world of regret in the name. Around them, the hall erupted in whispered conversations as the implications began to sink in. A noble daughter raised as a servant. A bloodline thought lost revealed. The careful balance of clan politics suddenly thrown into uncertainty. For Alva, the moment was both triumph and terror. She had found her father, but in doing so, she had also opened a door she might not be able to close. The simple life of a servant, hard as it had been, was about to be replaced by something far more complex and dangerous. For Rolf, it was as if the past had reached out to claim him, demanding payment for debts he had thought forgiven by time. The daughter he had never known existed stood before him, carrying the weight of choices he had made and their unforeseen consequences. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth seemed unable to reach the chill that had settled over both their hearts. The days following the revelation passed like a fever dream, where familiar patterns shattered and reformed in configurations no one could have predicted. Dawn came grey and cold to the settlement of Clan Ulfheim, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the frost that had settled between the hall's occupants. Rolf found himself caught in a peculiar torment, wanting desperately to know this daughter who had emerged from his past like a ghost made flesh, yet having no earthly idea how to bridge the chasm of 21 years. He had faced shield walls and berserkers, had negotiated with kings and intimidated jarls, but the prospect of speaking to Alva left him as uncertain as a green boy facing his first battle. His initial attempts were clumsy affairs that left them both uncomfortable. The morning after the revelation, He had approached her as she worked in the kitchen, clearing his throat awkwardly before offering to help with her tasks. The other servants had scattered like startled birds, leaving them alone among the hanging herbs and clay storage pots. "You need not serve others anymore," he had said, his voice gruff with unspoken emotion. "You are my daughter." That means something in this hall. Alva had continued, scraping the last meat from a deer bone, her movements precise and economical. "I have served here for 3 years, and it has given me purpose. I would not know what to do with myself if I sat idle. You could learn other things, the arts that befit a woman of noble birth. Music, perhaps, or the keeping of accounts." She had looked up then, and he was struck again by how much of Astrid he could see in the shape of her eyes and the stubborn set of her jaw. "My mother taught me letters and numbers already. As for music, I fear my voice is better suited to calling pigs than entertaining nobles." The dry humor in her response had surprised him into a short laugh, the first genuine amusement he had felt in longer than he cared to remember. But the moment of connection had been fleeting, dissolved by the weight of everything unsaid between them. The clan's reaction to the new arrangement proved equally complex. Some of the older warriors, men who remembered Rolf's glory days and respected his battle-scarred wisdom, accepted Alva's elevated status with the philosophical resignation of those who had seen stranger turns of fate. They treated her with careful courtesy, neither warm nor cold, watching to see how the situation would develop. Others, particularly among the younger men, viewed her rise with suspicion and resentment. Chief among these was Bjorn the Young, whose hostility toward Alva seemed to grow with each passing day. The Jarl's son had always expected to inherit a position of prominence within the clan, and the sudden appearance of another potential claimant to noble status clearly rankled. She appears from nowhere, with convenient tales and trinkets. Bjorn complained loudly enough for half the hall to hear during the evening meal. And suddenly we are to believe she shares the blood of heroes. What next? Shall every thrall in the settlement claim kinship with Odin himself? His mother, the sharp-tongued Ingrid, was more subtle but perhaps more dangerous in her opposition. She said nothing directly against Alva, but her silences spoke volumes. And the other noble women of the settlement took their cues from her cool reception of the newcomer to their ranks. Jarl Magnus, ever the politician, adopted a wait-and-see approach that committed him to nothing while preserving his options. He granted Alva a place at the high table during formal meals and assigned her a small chamber of her own near the women's quarters, but he did so with the air of a man making temporary arrangements that could be easily reversed if circumstances changed. It was during one of these stilted evening meals that Alva first revealed the depths that lay beneath her servant's demeanor. The conversation had turned to the growing boldness of the sea raiders who had been harrying the coastal settlements, and several of the men were debating the best methods for defending against such attacks. "The problem is not the raids themselves," declared Einar Ironbeard, one of Magnus's most trusted advisors. "Pirates have always existed. The problem is that they strike and vanish before we can respond in force. Then we must make them come to us," suggested young Thorvald, barely 18 and eager to prove his wisdom. "Set a trap with sufficient bait, and they will walk into it willingly. And what bait would draw sea raiders inland, away from their ships?" Bjorn asked with barely concealed scorn. "They are not so foolish as to abandon their escape route for the promise of easy plunder. The bait need not draw them inland," Alva said quietly, speaking for the first time during the discussion. "It need only convince them to stay longer than they should." The table fell silent, surprised to hear the serving girl turned noble offering tactical advice. Bjorn's expression suggested he was preparing to dismiss her words with withering sarcasm. But Rolf leaned forward with interest. "Explain," he said simply. Alva set down her eating knife and looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "A raid succeeds because it is swift and unexpected. The raiders strike, take what they can carry, and leave before organized resistance can form. But what if they believed their first strike was only the beginning of a larger opportunity?" "Meaning?" Magnus asked, his politician's instincts alert to the possibility that this young woman might possess insights his advisors had missed. "You stage a false retreat," Alva continued, her voice growing more confident as she warmed to her subject. "Make it appear that the settlement's defenders have fled in panic, leaving behind not just the normal plunder, but something truly valuable. Let the raiders believe they have found a prize worth risking everything for." Einar stroked his grey beard thoughtfully. "And while they are examining this prize, your real warriors close the trap from positions they prepared beforehand. The raiders find themselves caught between the sea and an enemy who knows the ground better than they do. The elegance of the strategy was immediately apparent to every fighting man at the table. It required careful planning and disciplined execution, but it turned the raiders' greatest strength, their mobility, into a liability. "Where did a servant girl learn to think like a general?" Bjorn demanded, though his tone held more curiosity than mockery now. Alva's smile was small, but not without pride. "My mother may have fled her clan, but she did not forget the lessons of her upbringing. She taught me that survival often depends on thinking like your enemy, understanding what they want and what they fear." Rolf felt something stir in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the mead he had been drinking. This was his daughter speaking, displaying the kind of tactical thinking that had made his own reputation on a dozen battlefields. In her words, he heard echoes of conversations with Astrid, who had possessed a quick mind and a gift for seeing patterns others missed. "It is a sound strategy," he said aloud, and the approval in his voice was unmistakable. "With proper preparation and the right circumstances, it could work well." The acknowledgement from Rolf carried weight that Alva was only beginning to understand. Around the table, she could see the other men reassessing her, perhaps for the first time, seeing past the servant's dress to the mind beneath, but she could also see Bjorn's expression darkening further, and she realized that her small victory might have cost her more than she had gained. In proving herself worthy of respect, she had also proven herself a threat to those who preferred the old arrangements, the family ring that now adorned her. Ufinga, her mother's final gift and proof of her heritage, felt suddenly heavy with the weight of expectations and dangers. She was only beginning to comprehend. The first snow of winter arrived early that year, blanketing the settlement in pristine white that made even the most humble buildings appear touched by beauty. But beneath the peaceful exterior, tensions within Clan Ulfheim continued to simmer like coals banked for the night, ready to flare into flame at the slightest provocation. Rolf had taken to spending his mornings with Alva, teaching her the history of their family line with the patience of a man discovering unexpected joy in the role of father. They would walk the settlement's perimeter while he spoke of battles fought and honors won, of the ancestors whose blood flowed in her veins and the responsibilities that came with noble birth. "Your great-grandfather was Orm the Sea-Wolf," he told her one crisp morning as they paused beside the ancient runestone that marked the settlement's founding. "He carved these runes himself, claiming this land for our clan when the world was younger and the old gods walked more freely among men." Alva traced the weathered symbols with one mittened finger, marveling at the connection to a past she had never known existed. "What did he die of?" "Old age, believe it or not, most unusual for a warrior of his generation. He lived to see 70 winters, which was almost unheard of in those days." Rolf's smile held both pride and sadness. "Your grandmother used to say he was too stubborn to die young, that death itself was afraid to face him in single combat." These conversations revealed sides of Rolf that few in the settlement had ever seen. Away from the political maneuvering of the Great Hall, he displayed a gentleness and thoughtfulness that contrasted sharply with his fearsome reputation. Alva found herself beginning to understand the man her mother had loved, seeing past the scarred exterior to the complex soul beneath. But their growing bond did not go unnoticed, and not everyone viewed it favorably. Bjorn's resentment had curdled into something approaching hatred, fed by his perception that Alva's presence diminished his own importance within the clan hierarchy. His complaints grew louder and more frequent, often voiced just within earshot of his father. "She has bewitched him," Bjorn declared to anyone who would listen. The great Rolf One-Ear, reduced to playing nursemaid to a bastard foundling. It is painful to watch such a mighty warrior brought low by sentiment. His words found fertile ground among some of the younger warriors, men who had grown up hearing tales of Rolf's legendary ferocity and found it difficult to reconcile those stories with the man who now spent his time teaching. A former servant about family genealogy, the situation came to a head on a grey afternoon when Alva was practicing with a wooden sword in the settlement's training yard. Rolf had suggested she learn basic weapon handling, not because he expected her to become a warrior, but because every member of a Norse clan needed to be capable of defending themselves when necessity demanded it. She had proved surprisingly adept with the blade, her movements displaying a natural grace and timing that spoke of inherited talent. Rolf watched with growing pride as she worked through the basic forms he had taught her, correcting her stance with gentle words and demonstrating proper technique with the patience of a master craftsman. "Teaching a promising apprentice. Your balance is improving," he observed, as she completed a series of practice cuts against a straw target. "But remember to let the blade's weight work for you. A sword is not a club. It cuts best when guided rather than forced." Alva nodded, adjusting her grip according to his instruction. When Bjorn's voice cut across the training yard like a whip crack, how touching! The famous Rolf One-Ear teaching swordplay to his pet servant. The words brought every head in the yard around to face them. Bjorn stood at the yard's entrance with several of his closest companions, his handsome face twisted with the kind of cruel amusement that suggested he had been planning this confrontation for some time. Rolf straightened slowly, his single eye fixed on his cousin's son, with the focused intensity of a predator marking prey. "You will watch your tongue, boy, or I will cut it out and feed it to the ravens, will you?" Bjorn laughed, but there was a brittle edge to the sound. The Rolf One-Ear of legend might have made good on such a threat, but that man died somewhere in the years between glory and dotage. The man before me is content to play grandfather to a bastard foundling who claims noble blood based on a servant's lies. The insult was calculated to provoke exactly the response it received. Rolf's hand moved to his sword hilt with reflexive speed, and for a moment the air in the training yard seemed to crackle with the promise of violence. But before he could draw steel, Alva stepped between them, with a calmness that surprised everyone present. "I claim nothing," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I ask for nothing. I seek only to know my father, and to honor the memory of my mother. If that offends you, young Bjorn, perhaps the fault lies not in my parentage, but in your own insecurity." The response was so unexpected and delivered with such quiet dignity that Bjorn was momentarily speechless. Around the yard, several of the watching warriors exchanged glances that suggested Alva had just risen considerably in their estimation. "You dare," Bjorn began, but Alva cut him off with a raised hand. "I dare to speak truth, which seems to be in short supply these days. You fear that my presence diminishes your standing within the clan, but consider this: a man secure in his own worth does not feel threatened by the elevation of others. Perhaps instead of resenting my good fortune, you might examine why you feel so fragile in your position." The words hit their target with the precision of a master archer. Bjorn's face flushed red with anger and humiliation. While around the yard, several of the older warriors struggled to hide their amusement at seeing the arrogant young man so neatly punctured. But Alva was not finished. With a movement that flowed like water, she raised her wooden practice sword in a formal salute. "If you question my right to train with weapons, perhaps you would care to test my skill yourself. I'm only a bastard foundling after all. Surely defeating me would be a simple matter for a warrior of your obvious talents." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, impossible to ignore and dangerous to answer. Bjorn found himself trapped by his own words. To refuse would make him appear cowardly, but to accept meant facing the possibility of defeat at the hands of someone he had just dismissed as beneath notice. "This is foolishness," Rolf growled. But there was a note of pride in his voice that suggested he was not entirely displeased with his daughter's bold challenge. From across the yard came the deep blast of the war horn that summoned the clan to assembly, the ancient horn of Clan Ulfheim that had called warriors to battle for generations. The sound cut through the tension like a sword through silk, reminding everyone present that there were larger concerns than personal grudges and wounded pride. Whatever message the horn carried, it would have to wait for resolution of the challenge that now stood between them, crackling with the promise of consequences that would ripple far beyond this snowy training yard. The war horn's call had summoned them to news that made personal conflicts seem suddenly trivial. Scouts had returned with reports of ship movements along the coast. Not the usual small raiding parties, but a substantial force flying banners that older warriors recognized with grim expressions. The confrontation between Alva and Bjorn was forgotten as the clan gathered to hear what their watchers had seen. But that evening, as the settlement prepared for the possibility of siege, Alva made a discovery that would forever change her understanding of the past. While helping to organize the women's quarters for potential refugees from outlying farms, she had been moving her few possessions from the servants' area to her new chamber, when her fingers found something unusual sewn into the lining of her mother's old travel pack. Hidden there, wrapped in oiled cloth and preserved against time and moisture, were letters. Not one or two, but dozens of them, written in her mother's careful hand on whatever scraps of parchment or bark she could find. The first was dated just 3 months after the raid that had scattered the Raven clan, and the last bore a date from only 2 years before Astrid's death. They were love letters, every one of them addressed to Rolf, though none had ever been sent. Alva's hands trembled as she read by candlelight, discovering a side of her mother she had never imagined. Here was not the resigned servant woman who had raised her, but a passionate young woman pouring her heart onto parchment, writing to a man she believed was dead but could not stop loving. "My beloved Rolf," read the first letter, "I write this knowing you will never read these words. But my heart is so full of things unsaid that I must speak them somewhere, even if only to the empty air. The raiders came 3 days after you left, as if they had been waiting for your forces to depart. I tried to find you among the dead, but there were so many bodies, and the crows had already begun their feast." The letters chronicled Astrid's escape, her desperate search for news of Rolf's fate, and her gradual acceptance that he must have perished in the fighting. They spoke of her pregnancy, discovered only after reaching the Christian settlement, and her joy at carrying a part of him even as she mourned his loss. "The child grows strong within me," one letter read. "I feel her moving, and I imagine she has your restless spirit. The monks say I should give thanks that God has blessed me with new life to replace what was lost. But how can I be grateful when every flutter of movement reminds me that you will never see your daughter's face?" Later letters revealed the depth of Astrid's sacrifice and the weight of choices made in desperation. She had worked as a healer and herb woman, using skills learned from her own mother to support herself and her child. The Christian settlement had offered safety but demanded conformity, and Astrid had embraced their faith, partly from genuine belief and partly from the protection it offered. "I have taken the cross they offered me," one letter read, "not because I have forgotten the old gods, but because their Christ promises hope for reunion with the dead. If there is any truth in their teachings, perhaps we will meet again in whatever realm awaits beyond this world." The letters grew more painful as the years passed and hope faded into memory. Astrid wrote of watching Alva grow into a young woman who bore her father's strong jaw and determined spirit, of struggling with whether to tell her daughter the truth about her heritage, of dreams where Rolf appeared to offer guidance she desperately needed. "She is so much like you," one letter observed, Yesterday I watched her face down 3 older children who were bullying a smaller boy, and I saw the same fierce protectiveness that first drew me to you. She has your courage, my love, but also your quick temper. I fear what the world will make of such a spirit in a woman's body. The most devastating letter was among the last, written when Astrid had realized her illness would likely prove fatal. In it, she wrestled with the decision of whether to reveal Rolf's identity to their daughter, weighing the pain of truth against the comfort of continued ignorance. I have decided to tell her, the letter concluded. She deserves to know her heritage, even if it brings her pain. You were a man worth knowing, worth remembering, worth being proud to call father. If our daughter must face the world alone, let her at least face it knowing she comes from strength. The final letter was different from all the others, written in a shaking hand as death approached. It was not addressed to Rolf, but to Alva, though Astrid had hidden it with the others, rather than giving it directly to her daughter. My beloved child, it read, if you are reading this, then you have found the courage to seek the truth I was too weak to speak while I lived. Your father was Rolf One-Ear of Clan Ulfheim, the greatest warrior I ever knew, and the only man I ever loved. He did not abandon us. He believed us dead, as I believed him dead all these years. Seek him if you can, but do not seek him for what he can give you. Seek him because you are his daughter, and he deserves to know what a remarkable woman you have become. Alva lowered the final letter with tears streaming down her face, understanding for the first time the full scope of the tragedy that had shaped her life. Her parents had loved each other deeply, completely, and had been separated not by choice, but by cruel circumstance and the chaos of war. But with understanding came anger at the waste of it all, at the years her mother had spent believing herself widowed, at the loneliness that had marked both their lives. If fate had been kinder, if communication had been possible, if any of a dozen small things had gone differently, she might have grown up knowing her father's love, and her mother might have died in the arms of the man she never stopped loving. The discovery of the letters transformed everything Alva thought she knew about her parents and herself. Her mother had not been a powerless victim of circumstance, but a woman of remarkable strength who had built a life from nothing and raised a daughter with love and wisdom. Her father had not been a callous warrior who abandoned his responsibilities, but a man who had mourned what he thought he had, lost and carried that grief for 21 years. As she carefully wrapped the letters back in their oiled cloth, Alva felt something hardening inside her chest, a resolve that had nothing to do with the external threats facing the clan and everything to do with ensuring that the love story chronicled in those yellowed pages would not end in tragedy. Outside her window, snow continued to fall on the settlement of Clan Ulfheim, but inside her heart, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would remake both her relationship with her father and her understanding of what it meant to be worthy of the love that had created her. The morning after, Alva's discovery of the letters brought a ceremony that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. In the great hall of Clan Ulfheim, with the ancient symbols of the family carved into the pillars around them, Rolf stood before the assembled clan and formally acknowledged Alva as his daughter and heir. The silver arm ring he placed on her wrist had belonged to his own father, and his father before him, a tangible link stretching back through generations of warriors and leaders. The metal was warm from his hands as he spoke the ritual words that would bind her forever to the clan's destiny. By blood and bone, by steel and honor, I claim this woman as my daughter, Rolf's voice carried to every corner of the hall, formal and weighty with tradition. Let any who would dispute her place speak now, or hold their peace forever. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackle of the central fire. Even Bjorn, who had spent weeks voicing his objections, remained quiet in the face of such ancient ceremony. To challenge the formal acknowledgement now would be to challenge not just Rolf, but the very foundations of clan law. Jarl Magnus stepped forward, his political instincts recognizing the importance of appearing to support the decision publicly, whatever his private reservations might be. The clan recognizes Alva Rolf's daughter as noble-born and worthy of the honor her bloodline brings. May she prove as brave in battle and wise in council as her father before her. The formal words were echoed by the assembled warriors, though Alva could hear varying degrees of enthusiasm in their voices. Some, particularly the older men who remembered her tactical insights, seemed genuinely pleased. Others offered the required words with the mechanical precision of men fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing joy. But the ceremony, meaningful as it was, proved to be only the calm before a much greater storm. 3 days later, the external threat that had been gathering like thunderclouds finally broke over them with devastating force. The attack came at dawn, when the settlement's defenders were at their weakest and most vulnerable. But it was not the coastal raiders they had been expecting. It was something far worse. A force of hardened warriors struck the settlement's outer defenses with the precision of a military operation, their movements coordinated, and their tactics speaking of leadership that understood both warfare and the specific vulnerabilities of Clan Ulfheim's position. Alva's first taste of real combat came as she helped evacuate women and children from the outlying buildings to the safety of the great hall's thick walls. She moved through the chaos with her newly gifted sword at her side, the lessons Rolf had taught her suddenly taking on desperate relevance. When an enemy warrior broke through the defensive line and came charging toward a group of terrified children, Alva found herself moving without conscious thought. Her blade met his with a ringing clash that sent shockwaves up her arms, but her stance held firm and her counterattack found its mark. The warrior fell, and Alva stared at the blood on her sword with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. "Well struck," came a voice beside her, and she turned to find Erik Thorson, one of the younger warriors, who had watched her training with growing interest. He was bleeding from a cut above his left eye, but his grin was fierce with battle joy. "Your father teaches well." Erik was perhaps 24, with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing his place in the world. He had been born to a family of respected warriors, had proven himself in several raids, and was generally considered one of the more promising young men of his generation. That he would speak approvingly to her in the midst of battle meant more than any formal ceremony could have conveyed. The attack was repelled, but at a cost that left the clan bloodied and shaken. 7 good warriors had fallen, including old Gunnar Ironside, who had served 3 generations of jarls with unwavering loyalty. The settlement's outer defenses were damaged. Several buildings had been burned, and the livestock pens had been scattered, with many animals lost or killed. But perhaps more importantly, the attack had revealed the hand of an enemy who knew them too well. The raiders had struck at precisely the right moment, targeting exactly the right weaknesses, moving with a familiarity that spoke of inside knowledge or long observation. This was no random raid, Rolf observed as he examined the battlefield with the eye of a veteran warrior. Someone planned this carefully, studied our defenses, waited for the perfect moment to strike. Jarl Magnus nodded grimly, his face showing the strain of command under fire. "The question is who? We have enemies, certainly, but none who should know our ways so intimately." It was Erik who provided the first clue, approaching the leadership group with something he had found among the enemy dead. "My lord," he said, addressing Magnus formally but glancing toward Rolf and Alva as well. "You should see this." The object in his hands was a shield boss, torn from one of the fallen raiders. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, but closer examination revealed a device carved into the iron, a stylized blood eagle. Wings spread in the ancient symbol of victory through sacrifice. The recognition was immediate and chilling. Every warrior present knew that symbol, though none had seen it for more than a decade. It was the mark of Clan Bloodaxe, led by a man whose very name was spoken with a mixture of respect and revulsion throughout the Norse lands. Grim the Ruthless, Rolf breathed, his single eye fixed on the shield boss with an intensity that seemed to burn. After all these years, he finally shows his hand. The name sent a ripple of unease through the assembled warriors. Grim the Ruthless was a legend in his own right, but a legend built on treachery and brutality rather than honor. He had once been counted among the greatest warriors of his generation, but ambition and cruelty had led him down darker paths. "You know this man?" Alva asked, though something in her father's expression suggested the answer would not be pleasant. Rolf's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Know him? Girl, I taught him everything he knows about warfare. Grim the Ruthless was once my closest friend, my shield brother, the man I trusted above all others." His voice dropped to a growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Until the day he proved that trust was a mistake that cost more lives than I care to remember." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, adding new dimensions to their current crisis. This was not just an attack by enemies, it was a reckoning with the past, a settling of accounts that had been decades in the making. And as Alva looked at the silver arm ring that marked her as Rolf's daughter and heir, she realized that whatever history lay between her father and this Grim the Ruthless, she was now part of it, whether she chose to be or not. The full truth came 3 days later, when a single rider approached the settlement under a banner of parley. He bore with him not just words, but a war banner that made the blood freeze in the veins of every warrior who saw it, the crimson and black standard of Clan Bloodaxe, depicting the spread-winged eagle that gave the clan its fearsome name. But it was not the banner itself that struck terror into hearts already hardened by decades of warfare. It was what the banner represented, and more importantly, who commanded the forces that marched beneath it. The messenger, a grizzled warrior with ritual scars covering half his face, delivered his message with the formal courtesy that preceded the bloodiest conflicts. Grim the Ruthless, Jarl of Clan Bloodaxe, scourge of the eastern seas, sends greetings to his old friend Rolf One-Ear, the messenger intoned, his voice carrying clearly across the settlement's courtyard. He requests the honor of personal combat to settle matters that have remained unfinished for too many winters. The words sent a chill through the assembled clan that had nothing to do with the late autumn air. A formal challenge from Grim the Ruthless was not simply a call to single combat, it was a death sentence wrapped in the ceremonies of honor. The man had never been defeated in personal battle, and his reputation for cruelty meant that defeat would bring not just death, but degradation. Rolf stepped forward, his single eye fixed on the messenger with the steady gaze of a man who had faced death so many times. It held no more terror for him. "Tell your master that I accept his challenge. But first, let him hear the full tale of why he seeks my death, so that all present may judge which of us has the greater claim to justice." The messenger nodded, clearly expecting this response. "My lord anticipated your words. He sends this token of remembrance, that you might recall the full scope of your crimes against him and his." From his saddlebag, the warrior produced an object that made Rolf stagger as if he had been struck by a physical blow. It was a woman's comb, carved from walrus ivory and inlaid with silver wire in intricate patterns. But more than its beauty, it was its familiarity that drove the breath from Rolf's lungs. Alva watched her father's face crumble as he stared at the comb, understanding without words that this was something that had belonged to her mother. But how it had come to be in Grim's possession and what its presence meant remained a mystery that filled her with growing dread. 21 years ago, the messenger continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a man reciting a carefully rehearsed speech. Rolf One-Ear led a raid against the peaceful settlement of the Raven clan. In that raid, he seduced and abandoned Astrid Eric's daughter, leaving her with child when he departed to seek greater glory elsewhere. The words struck the assembled clan like thunder, but the messenger was not finished. When Grim the Ruthless, who had sworn a sacred oath to protect the Raven clan's people, returned to find the settlement burned and its people scattered, he searched tirelessly for survivors. He found Astrid Eric's daughter dying in the forest, having given birth to a daughter in the wilderness, with no one to help her but the ravens and wolves. Alva felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the implications became clear. This was not the story her mother had told her, not the tale of escape and rescue by Christian monks. This was something far darker, far more personal. Astrid lived long enough to tell Grim the truth of what had befallen her. The messenger continued relentlessly. How Rolf One-Ear had promised to return for her, had sworn oaths of love and fidelity, only to abandon her when the raiding season called him to other shores. She died in Grim's arms, cursing the name of the man who had destroyed her life. The lie was so smoothly told, so perfectly crafted to wound, that for a moment even Alva found herself questioning what she knew to be true. But then she remembered the letters hidden in her mother's belongings, the testament of love that stretched across 20 years of separation and grief. Rolf's voice, when he finally found it, was thick with pain and rage. "You speak lies, Grim's dog. Astrid lived and bore my daughter in safety among the Christian settlements. Your master twists truth like a smith bends iron, shaping it to serve his purposes." The messenger smiled, a cold expression that held no warmth or humor. "Then perhaps you will be interested to know that my lord has raised that daughter as his own, training her in the arts of war and vengeance. She fights now beneath the banner of Clan Bloodaxe, eager to meet the father who abandoned her mother to die alone in the wilderness." The words hit Alva like a physical blow, but they also revealed the fatal flaw in Grim's carefully constructed deception. If he truly possessed Rolf's daughter, if the child born of that long-ago love had been raised by enemies to hate her true father, then what was Alva? How could there be two daughters of the same union? "Your master's lies have grown tangled," she said, stepping forward to face the messenger directly. "For I am Alva, daughter of Rolf One-Ear and Astrid Eric's daughter, and I stand here alive and well, raised by my mother in love and honor until her death 3 years past." The messenger's composure cracked for the first time, his eyes widening as he took in Alva's appearance. There was recognition there, and something that might have been fear. "Impossible," he breathed. "She died." "The child died with her mother." "Then who?" Rolf asked quietly, his voice carrying a deadly edge. "Has Grim been raising all these years? What child has he filled with lies and hatred, training to be his weapon against me?" The truth, when it came, was worse than any of them had imagined. The messenger, his carefully prepared speech forgotten in the face of this unexpected revelation, let slip the reality behind Grim's deception. The girl, she was found among the refugees, claiming to be Astrid's child. "My lord took her in, believing—" He stopped, realizing too late that he had revealed more than intended, but Alva's quick mind had already grasped the full scope of the tragedy. Somewhere out there, another young woman believed herself to be Rolf's daughter, believed her mother had died abandoned and alone, believed her father was a monster who had destroyed everything she might have loved. Grim had taken an orphan child and crafted her into a weapon of vengeance, feeding her lies until hatred became the cornerstone of her identity. "What is her name?" Alva asked, though she dreaded the answer. The messenger straightened, as if remembering his dignity and purpose. "She is called Thora the Wolfborn, shield maiden of Clan Bloodaxe, and she has sworn a blood oath to see Rolf One-Ear dead for the crimes against her mother." The name meant nothing to Alva, but she could see recognition and horror dawning in her father's eye. This was personal now in ways that went beyond simple vengeance or territorial disputes. Grim had created a weapon out of suffering and deception, and that weapon was aimed at the heart of everything Rolf held dear. "Tell your master," Rolf said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "that I will meet him in single combat as he desires. But know this, when I kill him, I will tell his false daughter the truth about her parentage and the lies that shaped her life. Justice will be served for the living and the dead." The messenger spurred his horse and rode away, leaving behind a settlement that suddenly understood the true scope of the conflict they faced. This was not just war. It was a reckoning 21 years in the making, with innocent lives hanging in the balance and truth itself as the ultimate prize to be won or lost in the coming battle. The Raven's Eye Stone had been in Rolf's possession for 30 years, a gift from a dying skald who claimed it held the wisdom of Odin himself. No larger than a man's fist, the translucent crystal seemed to capture and hold light in ways that defied natural explanation. Now, as Rolf held it up to study the approaching army of Clan Bloodaxe, it revealed tactical possibilities that might mean the difference between victory and annihilation. "They are stronger than I expected," he admitted, lowering the stone and turning to face the war council assembled in the great hall. "Grim has gathered perhaps 200 warriors, and they are well equipped and disciplined. A direct assault on our defenses would cost us dearly, even if we managed to repel it." The numbers were sobering. Clan Ulfheim could muster perhaps 70 fighting men, counting the boys barely old enough to hold a sword and the greybeards who remembered battles from decades past. Against a force nearly 3 times their size, conventional tactics would be suicide. "Then we do not fight conventionally," Alva said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence she had developed over the weeks since her acknowledgement as Rolf's daughter. "We use the land itself as our ally, and we make them come to us on our terms." Jarl Magnus looked skeptical, though he had learned to take her tactical insights seriously. "Explain." Alva moved to the rough map spread across the great table, pointing to the narrow valley that led to their settlement. "They will expect us to defend the walls, to make our stand here, where we can shelter the non-combatants. But what if we appear to flee? What if we make them believe they have already won?" Eric, who had been assigned to the War Council partly for his proven courage, and partly because his growing relationship with Alva made him a valuable intermediary, leaned forward with interest. "A feigned retreat?" "More than that," Alva continued, her finger tracing a path through the valley. "We abandon the settlement entirely, make it appear that panic has scattered us to the winds. But in reality, our forces take hidden positions along the valley walls, waiting for the enemy to enter what they believe is an empty trap." Rolf studied the map with the eye of a master tactician, seeing immediately how such a plan might work. "The valley narrows here and here," he observed, marking the spots with chess pieces borrowed from Magnus's gaming set. "If we could collapse the paths at both ends once their force was committed, they would be trapped in a killing ground," Magnus concluded. And for the first time since the crisis began, his expression showed something approaching hope. But the plan was not without risks that went far beyond military concerns. To abandon the settlement, even temporarily, meant trusting the lives of every woman, child, and elder to the success of their gambit. If the plan failed, if Grim proved too clever to fall for the deception, the clan would be left defenseless and scattered. "There is another consideration," Rolf said quietly, his single eye finding Alva's face across the table. "Grim has brought his false daughter with him, this Thora who believes herself wronged by my abandonment. She will be looking for me specifically, and she will not be satisfied with simple victory. She wants personal vengeance. The thought of facing another young woman who shared her own burning need for answers, but who had been fed lies instead of truth, filled Alva with a complex mixture of sympathy and dread. How did one fight someone whose rage was based on deception, whose entire identity had been built on a foundation of carefully crafted hatred? "Let me speak with her," Alva said suddenly, the words surprising even herself. "If she truly believes herself to be your daughter, then we share more than just that claim. We share the pain of growing up without a father, of wondering about our heritage, of trying to piece together truth from fragments and stories." "Absolutely not," Eric said immediately, his protective instincts overriding tactical considerations. "You would be walking into certain death. This woman has been trained to kill you specifically. She represents everything that threatens the identity. Grim has created for her. Rolf's expression was unreadable as he considered his daughter's proposal. There might be wisdom in it, he said slowly. If Thora could be made to see the truth about her parentage, it would rob Grim of his most powerful weapon. But the risk is mine to take, Alva interrupted firmly, and the potential gain is worth considering. If I can reach her, if I can show her the letters that prove our mother's true fate, perhaps we can avoid unnecessary bloodshed. The discussion continued late into the night, with plans within plans taking shape as the council worked to address every contingency they could imagine. Messengers were dispatched to hidden caches of weapons and supplies scattered throughout the valley. Trusted warriors were assigned to lead groups of non-combatants to secret refuges in the high caves where they could wait out the battle in relative safety, but perhaps the most difficult preparation was the personal one. As dawn approached and the time for action drew near, Rolf found himself alone with Alva in the quiet of the great hall, trying to find words for everything he felt and feared. "I've been a poor father to you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. 21 years lost, and now when I have finally found you, I may lose you again before we have had time to truly know each other. Alva moved to sit beside him on the bench where this entire journey had begun, where she had first spoken the words that revealed their connection. "You have been exactly the father I needed," she replied gently. "Not perfect, perhaps, but real and present and willing to learn. That is more than many children receive." She pulled the wrapped letters from her pouch, the precious records of her mother's love that had sustained her through the darkest moments of doubt. "Mother never stopped loving you, never stopped believing that your separation was a tragedy of circumstances rather than a failure of character. She would want you to know that." Rolf took the letters with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from age or emotion was impossible to say. "I will read them when this is over," he promised. "When we have time for proper grief and proper healing." "When this is over," Alva agreed, though both of them understood that the outcome of the coming battle was far from certain. Eric found them there as the first light of dawn began to filter through the hall's high windows, his young face grave with the weight of responsibility. "The scouts report that Grim's forces are moving. They will reach the valley entrance within the hour." The time for planning was over. Now came the test of whether their carefully laid strategy would prove sufficient against an enemy who had spent 2 decades nurturing his hatred and preparing for this moment of reckoning as Sioux. They made their final preparations. Weapons checked and positions confirmed, Alva found herself thinking not of the battle ahead, but of the young woman who would soon face her across the field of combat. Thora the Wolfborn, raised on lies and shaped by hatred, believing herself to be fighting for justice when she was actually serving the very evil that had destroyed her real family. The irony was almost too bitter to bear. 2 young women, both shaped by the same tragedy, both seeking truth and justice, but on opposite sides of a conflict that should never have existed. One raised in love despite loss, the other raised in hatred despite safety. The silver arm ring on Alva's wrist caught the morning light as she strapped on her armor and checked her weapons one final time. The ring that marked her as Rolf's true daughter and heir, that connected her to generations of warriors who had faced impossible odds with courage and honor. Soon, she would learn if that heritage was enough to see her through the greatest test any of them had ever faced. The test of truth against deception, love against hatred, and the hope that even the deepest wounds might still find healing if approached with wisdom and courage. The war horn of Clan Ulfheim sounded one last time as the defenders took their positions, its ancient voice carrying across the valley like a prayer to the gods of war and justice. The echo had not yet faded when the first of Grim's scouts appeared at the valley mouth, and the final act of a 21-year tragedy began to unfold. The deception worked better than anyone had dared hope. When Grim's forces reached the settlement, they found what appeared to be clear evidence of panic and hasty retreat. Cooking fires still smoldering, valuables scattered as if dropped in desperate flight. the great doors of the hall standing open and undefended. From her concealed position, high on the valley's eastern wall, Alva watched through the crystal clarity of her father's raven's eye stone as the enemy forces spread through the settlement like spilled water. They moved with the confidence of victors claiming an easy prize, their discipline relaxing as they began to search for plunder and stragglers. She could pick out individual figures even at this distance, and her breath caught when she spotted a young woman moving with deadly grace through the abandoned buildings. Even without seeing her face clearly, Alva knew this had to be Thora the Wolfborn. Her movement spoke of training and purpose that set her apart from the common warriors around her. Thora wore mail that gleamed like silver in the morning light, and carried a sword that seemed almost too large for her frame, but which she handled with obvious skill. Her hair was pale as winter wheat, bound back in warrior braids that spoke of Norse tradition. And even at distance, there was something about her bearing that reminded Alva uncomfortably of her own reflection. The resemblance was probably superficial. Both were young women trained for war in a world that rarely offered such opportunities to their sex. But knowing that this stranger had been raised believing herself to be, Rolf's daughter created an eerie sense of looking at what she herself might have become under different circumstances. They are taking the bait, Eric whispered from his position beside her, his voice barely audible even though they were well concealed among the rocks and scrub pine that crowned the ridge. Look, Grim himself leads the main force into the killing ground. Alva shifted the stone's focus and found the man she had heard about but never seen. Grim the Ruthless was perhaps 50 years old, built like a bear, and moving with the predatory confidence of someone who had never met his equal in personal combat. His black blade, the weapon whose reputation had spread across the Norse lands like a plague, hung at his side, its dark metal seeming to drink light rather than reflect it. But it was the banner he carried that truly marked him as their enemy. The blood eagle spread its wings above him like a curse made manifest, the crimson and black cloth snapping in the morning breeze. With each step his horse took deeper into the valley. The trap was nearly perfect. More than half of Grim's force had entered the narrow section of the valley, with the remainder strung out behind them in a formation that would make retreat difficult once the killing began. Hidden warriors waited at both ends of the valley, ready to trigger the rock slides that would seal the enemy into their carefully prepared killing ground. But Alva found herself hesitating, her hand frozen on the signal arrow that would begin the slaughter. Somewhere down there, Thora the Wolfborn was about to die for crimes she had never committed, hatred she had never chosen, lies she had never questioned. The injustice of it sat in Alva's stomach like a cold stone. "Something is wrong," she murmured, studying the enemy formation more carefully. "They are moving too confidently, too casually. Either Grim is a fool, or—" Her words were cut off by the sharp whistle of arrows from the opposite ridge. But the arrows were not coming from Clan Ulfheim's hidden archers. They were coming from positions that should have been empty, fired by warriors who should not have existed. "Ambush!" Eric shouted, but his warning came too late. The valley erupted into chaos as Grim's true strategy revealed itself. The force they had been watching was only part of his army, perhaps not even half. The rest had moved into position during the night, using paths through the high country that Clan Ulfheim's scouts had not thought to watch. Now those hidden warriors struck like wolves among sheep, falling on the concealed defenders with devastating effect. The careful trap became a massacre, but not the one Rolf had planned. Alva saw her father's position overrun in the first moments of the attack, watched him fight with desperate skill against overwhelming odds, while his carefully positioned forces crumbled around him. The battle plan that had seemed so clever in the Great Hall was revealed as a child's game played against a master of war. "We have to help them," she said, already moving toward the path that would take her down into the valley. But Eric caught her arm, his grip like iron despite his youth. "We help no one by dying uselessly," he said firmly. "Look there on the southern approach. Your father lives, but he is cut off and surrounded." Through the stone, Alva could see Rolf fighting with the fury of a man who knew his death was approaching. His great axe, Skull-Splitter, had appeared in his hands as if summoned by need, and bodies were falling around him with each mighty stroke. But for every enemy he felled, two more seemed to take their place, and moving toward him through the chaos, her pale hair streaming like a battle banner, came Thora the Wolfborn, with murder in her eyes, and lies poisoning her heart. Alva's descent into the valley was a desperate race against time and overwhelming odds. She moved with the sure-footed grace of someone who had spent years navigating treacherous ground. But even her skill could not make the path quick enough to prevent what she feared was about to unfold below. Eric stayed close beside her, his loyalty overriding his better judgment as they plunged toward the chaos of battle. Behind them, the scattered remnants of Clan Ulfheim's forces were fighting individual battles for survival, their coordinated strategy shattered by Grim's masterful counter-ambush. By the time they reached the valley floor, the tide of battle had shifted dramatically. Rolf still fought with the fury of a berserker, but he was bloodied and clearly tiring. Skull-Splitter, his legendary axe reborn in this moment of supreme need, swept through enemy ranks like a scythe through grain. But the weapon seemed heavier in his hands with each passing moment. Thora the Wolfborn had reached him at last, and the sight that greeted Alva as she broke from the trees made her blood run cold. The two warriors circled each other with the careful intensity of predators, each seeking the opening that would end the fight decisively. But this was not simply a battle between enemies. It was a tragedy of the deepest kind. A father forced to fight the young woman who believed herself his daughter, who had been raised to hate him for crimes he had never committed. "I have dreamed of this moment for 20 years, Thora called out, her voice carrying clearly across the battlefield, despite the din of surrounding combat. "The moment when I would make Rolf One-Ear pay for abandoning my mother to die alone and afraid." Rolf's response was barely audible, thick with pain that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. "Child, you have been lied to. Your mother, whoever she was not Astrid Eric's daughter. I never abandoned anyone. I searched the ruins, mourned what I thought I had lost. Lies!" Thora's sword flashed in a vicious arc that would have taken Rolf's head if he had not managed to deflect it with his axe haft. "Grim told me the truth. How you seduced her with promises you never meant to keep. How you left her pregnant and defenseless when the raiding season called." The exchange continued as they fought, each seeking advantage, while words as sharp as blades cut between them. Alva watched in horror as the duel unfolded, seeing in Thora's movements an echo of Rolf's own fighting style, the same instinctive grasp of timing and distance that marked all truly gifted warriors. But she also saw something else: doubt. For all her proclaimed hatred, Thora's attacks lacked the killing fury that should have driven them. Some part of her, perhaps buried deep beneath years of carefully nurtured rage, recognized something in her opponent that gave her pause. It was then that Eric proved his worth in ways that had nothing to do with sword skill or courage. As Alva prepared to throw herself into the duel, he caught her arm and spoke words that cut through her emotional turmoil like a blade through fog. "You cannot save them both by fighting," he said urgently. "But you might save them both by speaking." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. This was not a battle that could be won with weapons, but a conflict of lies against truth, hatred against love. And she was perhaps the only person present who possessed the power to tip that balance. Drawing a deep breath that seemed to fill her entire body with resolve, Alva stepped into the circle where father and false daughter fought their tragic duel. "Stop!" she called out, her voice carrying with the authority of someone who knew herself to be speaking truth. "Stop this madness before it destroys everything that should be precious to both of you." Both warriors froze, their weapons locked together as they turned to stare at this unexpected interruption. Thora's eyes widened as she took in Alva's appearance, the quality of her armor, the silver arm ring that marked her noble status, the unmistakable resemblance that existed between them despite their different coloring. "Who are you to interfere in matters of honor?" Thora demanded, though her voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. "I am Alva, daughter of Rolf One-Ear and Astrid Eric's daughter," Alva replied simply. "I am the child you believe yourself to be, and I carry proof that will shatter every lie you have been told." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, stopping not just the duel, but the surrounding battle as warriors on both sides turned to witness this impossible confrontation. In the sudden quiet, Alva could hear her own heartbeat and the labored breathing of two people whose world was about to change forever. From her pouch, she drew forth her mother's letters, the testament of love that had survived 21 years of separation and grief. "Your mother, whoever she was not Astrid Eric's daughter. These letters, written in my mother's hand, tell the true story of what happened that day, and of the love that never died despite years of separation." Thora's sword wavered as doubt finally broke through the armor of certainty that had protected her beliefs. For the first time since childhood, she found herself facing the possibility that everything she thought she knew about herself might be built on lies. And in that moment of doubt, Grim the Ruthless struck like the serpent he had always been, his black blade seeking the heart of the man who had once been his closest friend. The black blade moved like lightning toward Rolf's exposed back, but it never found its mark. Thora the Wolfborn, raised on lies but gifted with a warrior's instincts, threw herself between Grim and his intended victim without conscious thought. The blade that should have ended Rolf's life instead pierced the young woman who had spent 20 years believing herself his daughter. The sound that escaped Grim's throat was part rage, part anguish, as he stared at the blood spreading across Thora's mail shirt. Whatever dark purposes had driven him to this moment, they had not included the death of the girl he had raised as his own weapon of vengeance. "You fool!" he snarled, but whether the words were directed at Thora or himself was unclear. "She was nothing to you, a stranger wearing the face of an enemy." Thora's voice, when she found it, was thick with pain, but also with a clarity that had been absent from her words for years. "Perhaps that is true, but I have spent my life believing that honor mattered more than hatred, that truth was worth dying for. If she speaks truth about the letters, about what really happened to Astrid Eric's daughter, then I have been a weapon in the hands of a liar." Alva knelt beside the wounded woman, pressing cloth against the wound with hands that remained steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "You saved his life," she said quietly. "Whatever lies you were told, whatever you believed, in the end you chose to protect rather than destroy. Show me," Thora whispered. "Show me the letters. Let me see the truth before I die." With gentle hands, Alva unfolded one of Astrid's final letters, the one that spoke most clearly of her love for Rolf and her hope that their daughter would find him someday. As Thora read, her face crumpled with the weight of revelations that shattered 20 years of carefully constructed identity. "She loved him," Thora breathed. "Your mother truly loved him, believed he would return if he could. And I have spent my life hating a man for crimes he never committed, but there was no time for further revelations." Grim's rage had transformed into something cold and deadly, and his attention had turned to Alva with the focused hatred of a man who saw his life's work crumbling before his eyes. "You," he growled, raising his black blade toward the young woman who had exposed his deceptions. "You should have died with your mother in the forest. I should have made certain of it when I found her body." The admission hit both Rolf and Alva like physical blows. Here was confirmation that Grim had indeed found Astrid after the raid, had known she lived and died without revealing her survival to the man who loved her. The cruelty of it, allowing Rolf to believe his lover and child dead while he crafted his elaborate revenge, spoke to depths of malice that defied understanding. Rolf's roar of fury shook the very air as he launched himself at his former friend with all the rage of a man whose deepest grief had been turned into a weapon against him. Skull Splitter met the black blade in a clash that rang like thunder, And for a moment, the two weapons seemed perfectly matched. Legendary steel against legendary steel. Honor against treachery, love against hatred. But Grimm had made a crucial error in revealing the truth. His admission had stripped away the moral authority that had driven his quest for vengeance, reducing it to mere malice and wounded pride. Without the righteousness that had sustained him, he was just another aging warrior facing an enemy who fought for something greater than himself. The end, when it came, was swift and decisive. Rolf's axe found its mark with the inevitability of justice long delayed, and Grimm the Ruthless fell to the earth with his black blade still clutched in hands that would never wield it again. The death of their leader broke the remaining spirit of Clan Bloodaxe's warriors. Those who could fled toward their ships, abandoning their wounded and their plunder in their haste to escape. The valley that had been a killing ground moments before became suddenly quiet, except for the moans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of exhausted survivors. Thora lived, though her wound would leave her weak for months to come. As Eric worked to bind her injuries properly, she grasped Alva's hand with surprising strength. "I have no family now," she said quietly. "No clan, no identity, except what I choose to build from truth instead of lies. What becomes of someone like me?" Alva glanced at her father, seeing in his single eye the same thought that had occurred to her. "You become family," she said simply. "You become someone's sister, someone's daughter by choice rather than blood. If you will have it, if you can forgive the years of deception that separated us. The banner that flew over Clan Ulfheim's settlement 3 months later bore new symbols alongside the ancient raven, a silver ring representing bonds chosen rather than inherited, and beneath it all, a simple wooden cross that honored Astrid's memory and the faith that had sustained her through the darkest years. Rolf, his hair now completely silver, but his spirit renewed by purpose, had thrown himself into the role of father with the same intensity he had once brought to warfare. He spent his days teaching both his daughters, for Thora had indeed chosen to become family, the skills they would need to lead when his time ended. Eric and Alva's wedding that winter was a celebration that brought together warriors from 7 clans, all eager to honor the young couple whose love had grown from the ashes of an ancient tragedy. Thora served as Alva's shield maiden, a role that spoke to bonds deeper than blood or birth. In the great hall where this story began, where a servant girl had first spoken words that would change everything, 3 generations now gathered each evening. Rolf would tell stories of the ancestors, Alva would plan for the future, and Thora would weave truth from the fragments of lies that had once defined her existence. And sometimes, when the fire burned low and the hall grew quiet, they would read together from letters written by a woman who had never stopped believing that love was stronger than loss, that truth was worth preserving, and that family was not just about blood, but about choosing to care for one another despite the wounds that life inevitably brings. The scar on Rolf's palm had faded with age, but its significance had only grown. It remained a symbol of connection across time and tragedy, proof that even in the darkest moments, love finds a way to leave its mark on the world.